Welcome to Convention 2020 and this session entitled Evolving Enforcement in a COVID World. It's always good to be with the membership. It's always good to talk with you all about the work of enforcement. We and our staff want you always to know what we're doing. You handed us our mission, and our responsibility is to provide excellent service to you consistent with that mission. The mission, by the way, in a nutshell, is to make sure that compliant schools are not disadvantaged by their commitment to compliance. Other groups, other bodies are involved in that as well. AMA, the Committee on Infractions, the Appeals Committee, the Independent Accountability Resolution Path are all involved, but enforcement certainly is one component of that broader infractions process. So I want to share with you today several things that may be of interest. We want to help you be fully informed on matters of enforcement. And I've got two colleagues here to help today. One is Derek Crawford, the other is Mark Hicks. Their names are in their video slides. You'll recognize them when you see them come up. And today, rather than organizing by subject, what we'll do is organize by time. We will start by looking backward. We'll look at 2020, some case numbers. We'll look at the status of the SDNY, the criminal cases, and look at the impacts of COVID over the last year. And then we'll turn a corner and look at some of those same subjects moving into 2021. We will leave time for questions at the end, and also please reach out to any of us directly to discuss anything that you'd like. So as we begin, and as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing within 24 hours after the conclusion of today's presentation. You can access the recording and the session information and on NCAA.org. So let's begin by looking back at some case-related data from 2020, and for that, Derek Crawford will lead us through those.
As John mentioned, 2020 was a remarkable year for a number of reasons. The pandemic certainly being one, but also very remarkable because of the significant number of cases that we were able to investigate and process and submit to the three committees on infractions. I think I would be very candid in saying I think it exceeded our expectations in terms of what we were able to do. We knew we were going to have a very busy year before the pandemic hit, just simply because of the significant number of cases that we were already investigating that were in the pipeline. But I think I know we were pleasantly surprised at what we were able to achieve and accomplish, notwithstanding the pandemic. What we have here on the before you is just kind of looking at a 3-year picture of where we've been in terms of cases we've investigated, submitted to the various committees on infractions. And again, this data covers all three divisions. If you look back at 2018, we had about 22 cases. Very few cases traditionally are heard by the committee. We resolved most of our cases outside of the hearing process, with 18 that year through the summary disposition. And I think many of you are familiar. Summary disposition is simply a process where we agree with the institution and involved parties, and therefore we're able to submit the case and have it resolved without a hearing. And so that's the data that you see in 2018. In 2019, we had about 10 more cases roughly that were submitted to the committees on infractions for all three divisions. We had a few more hearings. We had about the same number of summary disposition cases that were resolved, but we had a new processing option that came in as a result of recommendations by the Rice Commission that were adopted by the board, and that's the negotiated resolution process. Negotiated resolution is very similar to summary disposition, but it's with penalties. And so that process has worked very well with the 8 cases in 2019 for overall about 31 cases in 2019. 2020 was a banner year, as you can see from the data, 36 cases, continuing increase, and we had a significantly greater number of hearings in all three divisions, with Division 1 being the largest division where we had hearings. What's also noteworthy, if you look at the summary disposition cases from 2019 to 2020 were reduced by about 2/3, and largely that's because of negotiated resolution. So we're not utilizing summary disposition as much. because of the popularity of negotiated resolution. I think the membership and involved parties have really taken to this process. We like it. It's a more expeditious way to resolve cases where there's agreement. And again, it's also with penalties. So you can look at kind of where 2020 has been with a really big uptick, basically double from the previous year with negotiated resolution cases to 17. We expect that trend to continue because we've heard very favorable feedback from the membership as well as the Committee on Infractions and involved parties. So we look to continue to have a significant number of cases that are resolved through negotiated resolution. And the very bottom is what we call immediate penalties. That's a new processing vehicle that allows us to seek immediate penalties when there's a failure to cooperate in the infractions process. So that just gives you kind of a 3-year look with the most current year being 2020 and the record number of cases that we were able to investigate, process, and have submitted to the committees on infractions. Again, we look forward to a similar kind of record this year. We probably won't have as many cases, but it's something we are tracking and thought it was a very successful year. The next area I want to draw your attention to is, which is always of interest to the membership and certainly to us as well. What are the types of allegations in terms of what we are investigating in any given year? And also just the number of allegations that we investigate. Again, looking back at the last 3 years, you can see in 2018, about 58, last year, 89, and then in 2019, 89, and then last year, 2020, 118. So basically from 2018 to 2020, the number of allegations that we were submitted basically double. And that's consistent with the cases that were submitted. If you look down at what were those allegations, offers and inducements led the way, which is bylaw 13, which probably is not a surprise. Impermissible extra benefits was second in bylaw 16, and then recruiting, contacts, and evaluations again, bylaw 13. We continue to see a significant number of CARA violations, non-coaching staff duties, academic certification, financial aid, and then followed by academic misconduct. And so those are the most frequent allegations that we have seen that have been submitted over the last 3 years. One really positive note, the very last category is about academic misconduct, because in recent years, we had a significantly greater number of academic misconduct cases. And I think we are encouraged by the reduced number based on a lot of really great work done by the membership and being very proactive in the education you've done with your coaches and your student athletes, as well as work that we've done with our academic integrity unit and the Committee on Infractions. So that's an area that we are happy to see that has declined because it was a much higher area in terms of allegations just a few years ago. Also, it's very important that we look at from year to year who commits the violations. That's of great interest, I know, particularly to the compliance community, but to the membership in general. And so we track based on who is involved in committing the violations. And this really looks at what we've looked at over the past 5 years. So the largest category is head coaches. About 31% of violations over the last 5 years were committed by head coaches, followed very closely by assistant coaches at 27%. The next highest category would be the multiple coaching staff members at 9%. So if you look at those 3 categories together, about 67%, or 2 out of every 3 violations over the last 5 years have been committed by members of the coaching staff. There's additional data that shows also boosters, athletic administrators, and so forth. But that just gives you a snapshot of over the last 5 years who commits the violations. The other area that I want to draw your attention to is something that we know is of great interest to the membership, and that really deals with the average case duration. It's of great interest to the enforcement staff. I think of any area that we hear consistently that we need to continue to focus on is the length of our cases. And so it's something we pay great attention to, that we try to be very proactive to make sure that we can reduce the life cycle of a case. We believe the negotiated resolution, as you look at the very top, will help us to do that. The negotiated resolution is the shortest processing path for a case, a little over a year. Summary disposition is about 18 months. And then the hearing track cases are about 20 months. And so we continue to look for ways to reduce the life cycle of a case. We know how important that is to the institution that's involved in the infractions case, as well as the membership at large. So we always want to be able to present this data, let you see where we are and how we're doing in terms of the length of time it takes to investigate, process, and then have a case heard before the various committees on infraction. So this is data that covers all three divisions. The last slide is looking at our level 3 and secondary cases. As many of you know, Chris Strobel, who is a longtime member of the enforcement staff, a 20-year veteran, heads our level 3 and secondary staff. And this just gives you data from the 2020 year. There are about 3,300 cases. The vast majority were in Division 1, about 2,400, followed by Divisions 2 and then Division 3. And then you just see at the very bottom of the slide where the majority of the level 3 secondary cases were. The vast majority, not quite half, but were in recruiting, the playing and practice seasons, amateurism eligibility, extra benefits, and then eligibility in general. So that just gives you a snapshot of what Chris Strobel and his staff process. I think 2020 was a little bit less year in terms of cases reported. There have been some years where the level 3 secondary staff has processed around 5,000 cases. And so I think last year probably was a little bit of a blip or decline in that, and I'm not sure if that number will go back up. It just gives you a quick snapshot of what the level 3 secondary staff looked at in terms of cases that were submitted and processed just last year. And now I'm going to turn it back over to John.
All right, Derek, thank you for walking us through that. For anybody interested in more data, more information, there is lots more where that came from. So feel free to reach out. One piece of information that we don't measure accurately and that we don't have a slide on is the monetary cost of an infractions case to a school or to an involved individual, that is a coach or another individual on campus. Anecdotally, we know that the cost is high. We don't take any pleasure in that, but I share it here today because it might inform on a school's decision around compliance and decisions around funding in difficult financial times. As for our staff, as most of you know, we would always rather prevent a violation than process one. And right now, in these conditions, that's probably and perhaps as important now as ever. So I wanted to share that observation as well. Continuing with looking back on 2020, I wanted to take just a couple of minutes here to address the so-called SDNY, Southern District of New York, criminal cases. There's lots of discussion out there about these cases. I understand that, and we're happy to address them here. We need to honor confidentiality. Obviously, that's a legislated obligation that we all have, and these cases are in various stages of resolution, so I will share what I can. And probably the best thing to do is to just go briefly through a chronology of events. So September of 2017, we all remember that day, the federal prosecutors in New York held a press conference. That day, our staff also formed an investigative team for each school who was potentially involved. And then we're also immediately instructed to essentially stand down on our investigations and let the criminal process play out. We agreed to do that for the next 19 or 20 months. We were very limited in what we could do. And it wasn't until the spring of 2019 that we were given some sort of green light from the government to proceed with our investigations. So within the next couple of months, the enforcement staff issued the first several notices of allegations arising from SDNY behaviors. And through the rest of 2019, we issued about half of the notices of allegations in those SDNY cases. Those were investigated, those were charged and delivered to the involved institutions and involved individuals, if any, during those 6 or 7 months after we got authority in 2019 to begin the investigations. In the early part of this year, we issued all but 2 of the remaining SDNY cases. So most were investigated and charged before the pandemic, some more than a year ago. The ones that we investigated and charged include some very serious underlying allegations. Some of them also include allegations of violations of the head coach responsibility obligations, institutional failure to monitor, and lack of institutional control. Toward the middle part of 2020, there were 2 cases remaining. One was referred to the independent resolution path pre-NOA, that is during the course of the investigation. The other case, we completed the investigation, made the charging decisions, issued the notice of allegations, and that case was subsequently referred to the independent accountability resolution process. So one of the questions that we get a lot, and one of the concerns that we see, and Derek addressed this briefly a few minutes ago, was the duration of cases. And so this next slide shows the average duration of cases in Division I, kind of comparing a typical non-SDNY case with the SDNY cases. And when you take out the governmental delay at the beginning, the first 19 or 20 months, a typical infractions case, and mostly what I want you to focus on is that navy blue part of the bar graph over at the left. That is the investigative phase, the investigation. That's the part that the enforcement staff most controls. After notice of allegations is issued, we lose control over the timing. So that navy blue bar at the left, the average duration of a non-SDNY case is 9.2 months. As Derek mentioned, we're always trying to get that number down, but that's where it has been in recent years. The SDNY cases, the average duration of the investigations in those cases was 10.1 months. And so it's just a little bit less than 1 month longer than the duration of an average non-SDNY case after taking out the governmental instructions at the beginning. Having said that, we still understand the desire that the membership has, that the public has, in fact, that we have for resolution of these important cases. We understand that. We have felt that from the very beginning since the press conference was over in 2017. What I can tell you is that none of those cases right now are in the hands of the NCAA enforcement staff. All of those cases are either in the hands of peer review educators, that is the Committee on Infractions or the Infractions Appeals Committee, or the independent accountability resolution process. And one case has been finally disposed of, but all of the open cases are out of the enforcement staff's hands and are working through one of 2 resolution paths approved by the NCAA members. So continuing on our focus looking backward at 2020, I wanted to ask Derek to touch very briefly about the COVID impact on briefing. Like I said, most of the investigations were completed before the pandemic, but perhaps there was some impact on the briefing. So I'll ask Derek to address that and then turn it over to Mark to talk about the impact on recruiting.
Thanks, John. The COVID impact, I think, as John mentioned, on the investigative part, I think was surprisingly minimal. We were able to conduct investigations, but we did it in a way that's very different than what we've done in the past. And I think we just simply were able to utilize technology. We were able to do many of our interviews by Zoom or by Microsoft Teams. And so what we've learned is that technology has enhanced our investigative capabilities. And I suspect that we will continue to operate in that manner in a post-pandemic world. I think the preferred method to do investigations, particularly interviews and other things, is in person. But we've also learned that technology can significantly assist us from an efficiency standpoint, but also from a cost saving standpoint. With respect to the briefing schedule, I think that's where we've seen the greatest impact in terms of COVID-19 on the work of enforcement, and particularly on timeliness. We have had cases that have been slowed down significantly because of that, and particularly from a hearing perspective. The committee made a decision to postpone hearings for a number of months, and then ultimately started hearing cases by video conference. And so it had an impact on the briefing schedule in terms of our ability to get cases processed and heard by the various committees on infractions. An investigation and processing standpoint didn't have as much impact, but certainly on the briefing schedule and for our ability to get cases adjudicated and resolved, it certainly had a significant impact in terms of the timeliness of those matters. So we're hopeful that we'll get things moving again in 2021 with having more hearings by video, and I'll talk about that a little later as we look forward to this year and then beyond.
Thanks, Derek. It goes without saying that COVID has certainly impacted recruiting, and we know that in many different ways. I think the D1 Council has been very clear that the primary focus for campus should be the safety of the students, student athletes, the staff and coaches, administration, and then also just return to play and completing play. And recruiting has taken a back seat. At the same time, we also know that recruiting is a lifeline of these athletic programs, and there's a lot of pressure around that. So there's pressure from schools to ensure that student athletes have an opportunity to play that are coming into their program. There's pressure from the student athletes, prospective student athletes themselves, who certainly desire an opportunity to compete and play. The coaches, parents, we don't want to underestimate that, but the idea is that, there are a lot of people who want to be recruiting. And so managing recruiting efforts during a dead period that will now be almost 12 months, if not more, certainly creates a lot of challenges. And just because we're in a dead period doesn't mean recruiting is going away. With that, I think schools and coaches will find, creative ways to recruit. And we're seeing that play out. And for the most part, we've seen a lot of creativity in the sense of new ways to recruit that I think will be very beneficial. Some certainly push up against the lines of our rules, and in a few cases may have exceeded those rules. I think we are seeing a lot of level 3 scenarios, primarily where students or parents end up on campus, maybe unbeknownst to coaches in the schools, and may trigger some level of violation during a dead period. Again, those are level 3 and minimal. We've also seen others where you have more highly publicized recruiting trips, understanding that our recruiting services and our media are certainly looking for content and will follow those kids who may be a little more notable, high profile from a recruiting standpoint. So we've seen some attention around kids and their ability to work outside institutions, visiting campuses. Certainly a very fine line there between what's permissible and what's not. And again, in other places, we're actually fact gathering around situations where some of our schools or coaches or individuals may have, again, been more involved in and arranging some recruiting during the dead period. So that's in a fact-finding stage. We don't draw conclusions based on media. We look into situations and let those facts play out the way that they need to. Another trend that we're seeing that I think folks should be aware of is, and again, I chalk this up to just creativity during a dead period, is leveraging people off campus, maybe former players, professional athletes, to assist in recruiting. So where coaches can't have interaction, we have seen a couple scenarios where they've looked for other people to have that interaction on their behalf. And again, there's a fine line between what's permissible and what's not. But the use of third parties or third-party individuals in the recruiting process we're starting to see an uptick in some situations there. Regardless, though, I think the message and the lesson learned is that, good communication between the compliance staff and the coaching staff, and really in the national office, our academic and membership affairs staff, your conference office compliances folks, having that communication during this time of navigating recruiting during a dead period is really first and foremost, and I think something that we definitely should be tracking on and would be a best practice. John, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Mark. So we went through 2020 pretty quickly. Obviously, it was an eventful year in many ways. But I hope that gives you all in the membership a snapshot, at least of what our staff was doing these last number of months. And so having reflected a bit on what we did during 2020, let's turn a corner and look ahead and take a look at what likely faces us in 2021. As we saw and as we learned last year, nobody knows exactly what a year might bring. However, from where we sit right now with the information that we have available, we want to talk briefly about some things that we can anticipate coming out across the horizon. So it will be a significant year for the association. Obviously, our staff will be flexible and we will deal with whatever comes. But here's a preview. So let's go back to the case-related data just briefly. Derek has touched on this, but Derek, if you could just share just a little bit of what we anticipate in 2021, that would be helpful.
Certainly, John. For this year, as I mentioned earlier, I think we will continue to have a fairly heavy docket of cases that will be submitted to the various committees on infractions. I don't think that the docket will be as heavy as last year's docket of 36 cases, but that remains to be seen. But we do have a very heavy, but I'd say manageable caseload and docket for 2021. One of the things Mark mentioned in his remarks, we have seen a significant uptick in impermissible contacts during the dead period. And I think that's probably not unexpected when you consider that we've been in a dead period for a significant period of time, and coaches are being creative in terms of how to reach out and make contact with student athletes. And so we've had some concerns in that area as we've seen a significant uptick in impermissible contacts during the dead period. We've also had an increase, and this is going back a few years ago, but we saw a significant activity last year and anticipate similar this year. Impermissible contacts, what we call in the tampering area. That's an area that's been of great concern to the membership. And it's something that we are very actively focusing on. We get a number of reports from institutions and coaches in particular about the so-called tampering violations. So that's something we are monitoring and we've seen as an uptick in the past couple of years. We expect the negotiated resolution to continue to be a heavily used vehicle for resolving infractions cases. Again, we had 8 cases in 2019. We had 17 last year in 2020. I don't know what 2021 will bring, if it will come close to 17, but I anticipate that negotiated resolution will still be a very popular vehicle for resolving cases. Again, there's tremendous satisfaction from those involved in that process. We like it. Committee on Infraction likes it. Of course, membership and involved parties. So anticipate that negotiated resolution will be continuing path that we'll use. We also hope to have, I think we'll have a number of hearings this year. We have a number of hearings that have already been scheduled through the first 3-4 months of this calendar year. And so we expect to have the hearings resume, particularly in Division 1. They'll be done by video conference. There'll also be the normal appeals before the Infractions Appeals Committee. And so those are matters that we are actively involved in from the enforcement staff's perspective. Lastly, we'll continue to provide updates to the membership on our case activity and other data at regional rules, at conference meetings, and other opportunities that we have to engage with the membership. We want to make sure that we're transparent in our communications and the information that we report to you so that you know what's going on in enforcement and what we're working on. And so we'll continue to do that. And I think our next opportunity will be very likely at regional rules, which will also be done virtually. So those were just my thoughts in terms of looking forward to this year in terms of action from enforcement, and particularly from major level 1 and level 2 enforcement.
Yeah, thanks, Dirk, for looking ahead. And I would encourage and invite anybody in the audience or anybody in the membership who wants to know more information about the number or status of cases throughout the course of 2021. There are opportunities, as Derek mentioned. There's also information on our page of the website, or you can obviously reach out to any of us at any time. We'd be happy to fill you in. You don't need to wait until the convention of next year or a membership meeting to find out what we're doing. So continuing looking ahead, I want to touch briefly on the SDNY cases again. As noted a few minutes ago, these cases are all in the hands of either the peer review process or the independent accountability resolution process. Our staff will obviously defer to the appropriate bodies to work through those respective resolution paths, those different processes. We will do everything that we can, everything within our power to keep those cases moving. We have an interest in resolution of those as well. And we hope to look forward to seeing resolution of a number of SDNY cases this calendar year. Continuing with looking ahead, we'll switch from the case-related data and numbers to the COVID impact. We're still, obviously, as a world, as a nation, as an association, wrestling with the impacts of this pandemic. So we anticipate continued impact of COVID on dead period, on coaches, on campuses. And I'll ask Mark to share a few thoughts about what we might anticipate this year in this on this subject.
Thanks, John. It's tough to forecast right now, sitting here today, what the future of recruiting looks like in COVID. I know I would expect we're going to see both short and long-term impacts and changes. The sport-specific committees and other groups are starting to look at lessons learned, evaluating financial and logistical efficiencies that may be able to be employed, in the future. I think certainly virtual recruiting is a trendy term that we're starting to hear more about. And while there are a lot of benefits and things we're learning that are very positive about virtual recruiting, I think there are some dangers too. One specific concern I would ask our membership to track on is the purchasing of recruiting video, or what I call digital content. What's happened, and we were somewhat concerned about this coming out of the college basketball reform and the reduction of the live periods, where entrepreneurial folks are looking for ways to repackage content and then sell it to our institutions. And many of this content falls outside our recruiting service and our scouting service legislation and is essentially unregulated. And what's happening is in some cases it's permissible, or it's not impermissible necessarily, to purchase practice video of a prospect or purchase games, provided it's not being done as a recruiting service product. So again, that's virtually, or no pun intended, primarily meant to be, it's not meant to be, but it's outside of what's regulated. And literally, you'll have some third parties who are wanting to sell access to digital content with the presumed benefit of being able to recruit a student athlete. And so that's something we certainly are keeping our eye on, and that I think is important as we explore virtual recruiting, to look at what boundaries that we're placing on that new space to ensure that we support our schools and our institutions and keep them worry-free from violations. So again, I think looking forward, it's exciting in the sense that there's a real newness to recruiting and what we're seeing through the virtual landscape. But it is important for us to keep our eye on where some of those can get outside the banks of the river. So John, I think I'll flip it back to you.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Obviously, as we look at across 2021, one subject of great interest is NIL and transfers as well. And there are lots of open questions still around these subjects. At this moment, as we talk today, we're not sure. Nobody is sure what the legislative or regulatory framework will be for NIL. We're also not sure what direction or instruction we will receive, we as an association, from the various government authorities that may be active here, from the Supreme Court to Congress to the various state legislatures. So that is obviously a very wide open question. We're also not sure what direction the membership will choose to go with the information coming from Congress, or the Supreme Court or other authorities. So in enforcement, we are engaging and will continue to engage as appropriate with governance groups, with our friends and colleagues in the membership, to think through policy issues, practical considerations. And our pledge is, as a department, to stand ready, willing, and able to help make the NIL environment as positive as possible, both in providing information on the front end around policy decisions, and then also as needed execution and implementation after we have a legislative framework in place. One of the open questions that we've heard a lot, and I expect we'll continue to hear from you, is what, and one thing I know schools care a lot about, is what's expected of schools in the NIL environment. And again, as I've shared, it's a little too early to answer that with any degree of specificity, but what I can tell you and pledge to you is that enforcement will work as closely as we can with others on that question and provide, together with others, as much guidance as possible. We will try to work with members and with governance bodies and colleagues in the national office to find a regulatory approach that balances everyone's very legitimate interests here. We will also engage with a third-party administrator if that's the direction that the membership opts to go, and find a workable relationship there for everybody. And so as we sit here and record now, I hope those pledges are helpful. Those are our commitments moving forward. And as we go through 2021, again, I hope that you'll reach out, let us know about comments, questions, concerns, criticisms, and I hope that you will find our staff helpful as we move through these difficult NIL and transfer issues. So having said that, we're almost out of time for this portion of the presentation. We went quickly through lots of material. I hope that it was useful. I hope that at least some of it was helpful to you. We have reserved time. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, and we'll cover what we can in that portion. But if you don't get your question answered, or if you think of a question later, as I've said several times, do not ever hesitate to reach out to any of us or anybody who you may know on the enforcement staff, and we'll do what we can to make sure you have as much information as possible. So as we wind down, please complete the session survey. To access the survey, click on this session title in the agenda tab, and then from there, click on survey to complete the brief 3-question survey. Additionally, don't forget to join the conversation on social media. That information is on the screen. With that, I thank you for your time, and we will close this portion of the presentation and look forward to your questions in the Q&A session. Thank you again.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. My name is Brenna Barnhart, and I am a director on the enforcement staff, and I'm going to serve as the moderator for our panel today with John Duncan, Mark Hicks, and Derek Crawford. So if you have questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat, and we will get through as many as we can here in the next 15 minutes or so. So first, I'm going to start with a question that came in and give this to John, and then Mark and Derek always feel free to jump in. But one of the questions was surrounding just the ever-changing nature of college athletics, and especially right now heading into 2021 and the next academic year. So, John, how does enforcement identify what are its priorities and kind of areas of focus in light of kind of this ever-moving target?
Yeah, thanks, Brenna, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Glad to be with everybody. Welcome to the convention again. That's a question that we get a lot, and I'm always glad when we get that one, Brenna, because it gives us the opportunity to say, that we in enforcement do not just sit here in Indianapolis and decide what we think matters to the association and then dedicate our limited resources there. We work pretty hard to keep our finger on the pulse of what matters to member institutions. It may not always seem like it. I understand that, but we really do try to focus our time and the bulk of our resources on those behaviors that are both violations of NCAA rules and meaningful impacts, negative impacts on the collegiate model. Historically, generally, those have been items like academic misconduct, inducements, both pre-enrollment and post-enrollment in the transfer environment, extra benefits. Just speaking broadly, those are the things we focus on. But more importantly to the question, we base those priorities on input from member institutions and the stakeholders who we serve. And as the question noted, these times are changing. And so I guess I would invite this audience offline, obviously, to stay in touch with us and to make sure that we have our finger on the pulse of those behaviors that matter most to member institutions. We have got to balance lots of competing answers to those questions because not everybody agrees on those behaviors that matter most or threaten the game most seriously. But it does help to hear from stakeholders what matters, and we fashion our priorities and dedicate our resources based only and entirely on that input from members. So don't ever hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thanks, John. The next one I'm actually going to send to Mark. This is around just the ongoing dead period in light of COVID and perhaps how it's going to be extended. And so Zoom recruiting is really going to become a thing. So any thoughts on the, NCAA membership through our bylaws, liberalizing what can be done on Zoom?
Thanks, Brenna. It's a good question. Certainly a topic that's ongoing, and as our rules are fashioned, those conversations are being had by the Council Coordination Committee and then also the standing committees for respective sports. And I would imagine that those conversations will continue to evolve and pick up speed here as we begin to enter the end of that dead period, or what might be the extension. We don't know yet, but those are the groups that will be having those conversations about what the rules look like regarding recruiting once we emerge from the pandemic.
All right, thanks, Mark. This one is probably John and Derek because it's dealing with the new independent process. So, the questioner is asking, how does a school essentially fight a recommendation for their case to go into the new IARP process? And has a school ever successfully challenged that recommendation and essentially kept its case in the peer review model or traditional track? So maybe start with John and then Derek, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, the first part of that question is easy, and I can answer it with the citation to Article 19. The second part of that question is probably one that I won't be able to address, just given the confidentiality around pending matters. But the first question is, if I heard it correctly, was how does the school fight referral to the independent accountability resolution process? And the process by which a case is sent to the independent path is legislated. It all lives. Of course, it's limited to Division I. So it lives in the Division I manual, bylaw 1911. And the process is outlined there, and it's basic traditional motion practice. And there are three entities that can move a case, move for referral of a case to the independent path: the enforcement staff, the institution, or the Committee on Infractions. And and whoever moves puts the motion in, and the other parties have an opportunity to respond to it. So I guess to answer the question, Brenna, an institution who is not the moving party can respond to another party's motion. If the enforcement staff or the Committee on Infractions moves for referral, an institution has an opportunity through council to submit its reply, its opposition, its response. And then that motion, together with the following briefs that come in, are presented to the Infractions Referral Committee, which is made up of representatives from the council, the COI, the Independent Resolution Panel, and the Appeals Committee. That group then ultimately decides. And so the opportunity for school to fight is built into the motion practice. That's the first half of the question. The second half of the question is really gets into the deliberations of cases and which ones have been referred and perhaps which ones have not been. And I don't believe that the confidentiality bylaws of Article 11 allow us to speak to that. So better just leave it, Brenna, with the procedural answer. And when a case is referred, that's announced pursuant to the rules, and that's in strict compliance with Article 19. Not trying to be secretive. I just want to make sure that we don't get outside the rules here.
Great, thank you. So this is a question maybe, Mark, you can help us with. Question came in about whether there were any thoughts on simplifying the criteria needed to purchase or view a live stream. So if you can help us with that one.
No, thank you. That's really a great question, nuanced for sure. I think one of the things that we're going to learn more about as we again transition through the dead period and into the world post-pandemic is these lessons learned from the ways that we, our coaching community, our schools absorb evaluation opportunities, and live streaming or digital content is certainly one of those areas. So I think I would expect to see some revisions and growth in how we regulate that space, define it, and I think it's probably right for a review of kind of what all's entailed in evaluating that method. I think that's down the road a little bit, but that is something we're talking about internally and sort of tracking on. It's a really good question.
Great. This next one is kind of a two-parter. So I'm going to start with Mark and then maybe turn it over to Derek. And I know we touched a little bit on this during the presentation, but the question came in what are the top reasons we're seeing coaches involved in violations, or what are the top violations that coaches are involved in? So maybe I thought about, Mark, why don't you start from the development perspective? What are the concerns you're hearing about the types of violations we're seeing coaching staffs engage in? And then Derek, maybe you can then transition it into, the numbers of the recent cases that we're processing and the types of violations we're seeing there with coaching staff involvement. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thanks. I don't know, like it's a 100-year history of competing in college athletics, and there's a 100-year history of athletic programs, coaches, whoever, trying to gain some advantage. And I think comes from competitive juices and wanting to win. And it's part of what makes not the violations, but that competitive nature makes our business fun and unique and actually, something very interesting. And so I think as long as there are rules, there are always going to be a need the feeling that there's a need to gain an advantage and walk up to those lines. And sometimes they go over and for the most part, I think they're born out of just a desire to be competitive, and there's a whole host of issues. And I think you add in things like dead periods and our contact rules and balancing the interests of the time demands on kids and their schooling and recruiting opportunities, but also pressure for those kids to want to be recruited. All of these things kind of factor into different violations, different levels of violations, all the way to those are the most serious kind. And obviously with some of the money that's involved now is high stakes. So I don't know if I have one specific thing, but I do think it's inherent in our world, and we don't lack for hearing about concerns with rules violations. Derek?
Thanks, Mark. The only thing I would add, is the trends we've seen with respect to coaches involved in infractions cases have been consistent, since I've been on the enforcement staff almost a decade, and probably going back many, many years before that. So the percentage really hasn't changed. I think you all saw from the slide presentation that roughly about almost 67, almost 70% of allegations that were committed were involved a member of the coaching staff, either the head coach, assistant coach, or some member of the coaching staff. And I think to Mark's point, a lot of it is the competitive nature of college athletics, particularly at the Division I level, the desire to win. And it sometimes leads coaches astray to do some things and take some shortcuts that perhaps they otherwise wouldn't do. I think one of the things we also hear from coaches, and it's really important to us as an enforcement staff, we have a motto in our department that we want to be well at our job, because we don't want institutions, coaches, or student athletes disadvantaged by their commitment to compliance. And so what we hear sometimes from coaches is that, well, other coaches are doing this, and I feel that I have to do it in order to win. And so I think sometimes there's that pressure that, well, I'm not doing anything perhaps other than what someone else may be doing. So we take that very seriously, because we don't want a coach to feel like he or she has to take shortcuts or break rules to win, to be successful. We want them to do it the right way. But I think the competitive pressures that Mark talked about that we see in collegiate athletics kind of lead sometimes people to break rules, take shortcuts, and to do some things that perhaps otherwise they wouldn't do.
Hey, Brenna, before we move on, let me add one thing, and I agree with everything Mark and Derek have said. They're exactly right. Their comments are largely talking about the underlying violations, the behavior that maybe an inducement or a benefit or involvement in academic misconduct or whatever the impermissible activity is. There's another way, though, that coaches find themselves involved in cases, and I don't think we put this on the slide. But in addition to the underlying violation, there are also a number of times where coaches are charged for so-called derivative violations. That is, a coach who doesn't satisfy the obligations of Article 11.1, which is the head coach responsibility to promote an atmosphere for compliance and monitor direct and indirect reports, or under Article 10, which is unethical conduct when a coach, separate and apart from the underlying violation, then lies about it or destroys information or evidence that would have been material to the investigation, or otherwise refuses to interview or doesn't cooperate. So in addition to the underlying violations, we also have a number of instances where cases get more severe and more complicated when the derivative allegations are in play.
Thanks, John. And so I think we might have time for one more question. We'll see what the answer is here and what we're left with. But this is a question, John, Derek, Mark, and I can speak for myself too. I think we've all received plenty of times over the last few years. This person notes that it's been 40 months since the press conference that announced the SDNY, what are now collectively known as the SDNY cases, the FBI investigation, and that there are a lot of people asking why the resolution of these cases is taking so long. And I think that's, from personal experience, I think that's true both in the membership and then at in the public at large. So I don't know if, John, you want to start with this, and then Mark and Derek, you can chime in as well, but just want to give an opportunity because I know that is definitely a concern across the board.
Oh, it is. And I'm not surprised that we got that question here, because we get it every day, multiple times every day. And so the presentation spoke briefly to the chronology, and I'll see if I can drill down just a little bit more and maybe provide a little bit more information. But I'll say that the chronology that the questioner asked is right. I have said publicly before, and I'll say here again, that I'm frustrated and disappointed that those cases aren't resolved yet. So for starters, I'll share that enforcement is only one piece of a much broader infractions process. And the only panelists or the only presenters here are the enforcement staff. So I can speak to the investigative phase, the charging phase, those decisions that the enforcement staff made. What I can't speak to is what happens after notice of allegations is issued, because that's when the enforcement staff really loses control over the case or any case. So a few thoughts on these in particular. Again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago in the presentation, there was the first 19 or 20 months or so after the press conference, which, by the way, everybody on the enforcement staff understood the urgency of those cases the minute that press conference ended. And we that day formed a number of investigative teams, and we're ready to move forward at that time. And then, as I mentioned, we were pretty quickly encouraged not to do that. And for the next 19 or 20 months, we were very limited in what work we could do, if any, while we waited for the criminal proceedings to play out. Spring of last year, we did get what I would call a partially green light. We were not able to do everything that we wanted to do, but we were at least allowed to move forward with portions of those investigations. We moved as quickly as we could there, and we did not. We don't just adopt the work of other bodies, whether they're civil or criminal proceedings. We now obviously have the authority to import that information into the infractions process, but we don't rely on it entirely. And so we conducted our own independent investigations of those behaviors. And very quickly after we received authority to move forward, began to issue notices of allegations. Again, I went through the chronology of those in the material or in the presentations a little bit ago. We did encounter some delays in the investigations of those cases. There were instances of non-cooperation. I won't go into great detail about that. Some of that was within the membership. Some of that was with third parties who don't have an obligation to cooperate with us. Part of that was just information that was no longer available given the time that we were waiting. For example, student athletes graduated or left college, and we no longer had authority or ability to talk with them. Another thing that happened was that some of the cases are not limited in their facts to SDNY type behaviors. And so there may be SDNY facts or investigations or allegations involved in those cases. But there are also some that go beyond, and it took time, obviously, to investigate those. There are also procedural safeguards that are available to individuals and to institutions involved in the infractions process. And those are really important and really critical. And they are especially important if it's your school, or if you are the coach who is at risk. And while the rest of the membership is eager for swift justice, and I understand that, those schools that are involved avail themselves, and those coaches, as they should, of those procedural safeguards. Related to that, there are some sequential things that have to happen in order. And for example, one of those is resolving any outstanding interpretive disputes or questions. And there are sometimes in investigations or in infractions cases, those questions that we've got to get interpretive guidance, and that's appropriate, but it also takes time. But overall, I was pleased with the enforcement staff cadence and the speed with which the investigative teams conducted the investigations, made the charging decisions, and handed those cases off to the next stage of the infractions process. And as I said a few minutes ago in the remarks, they all live there now, either with the Committee on Infractions or the Infractions Appeals Committee, or with the independent resolution path. And so all of those are in the next phase of adjudication. And our staff will do everything we can do to keep those moving forward, because we understand the need and the desire for fair, appropriate resolution of those cases. So, Brent, I'm afraid we used up the bulk of the rest of the time. If there's anything brief, we can take it up. I'm not sure if there are other questions in the queue.
No, I don't think so, John. I think we're good to wrap it up. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Well, there probably are other questions out there. I don't know if they're in the queue or not, but as I've said several times, we want to hear from you. And if there are comments, questions, concerns, criticisms, better ideas, feel free to reach out to anybody who you know on the enforcement staff, any of the four of us participating here, or anybody else on the staff. We would love to hear from you. We want to stand alongside you. We want to prevent violations rather than process them. We want to satisfy our mission of protecting compliant schools, and we need your help in that regard. So never hesitate to reach out. Thank you for your interest in this session and for being part of this. We're about out of time, so we better land it here. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the convention, and have a great weekend.